The security of the nation is the first duty of the government. Are our armed forces properly funded to do the job?
Our army is now the smallest since Napoleon. We've lost 1 in 5 Royal Navy warships over the last 14 years and over 200 RAF planes.
That was a rather chilly warning from Luke Pollard. He is actually the new Armed Forces Minister, speaking to the BBC this morning, admitting that there was a serious problem. But who is going to pay for the solutions? We're going to be joined by Con Coughlin, our Defence and Foreign Affairs Editor, to ask, can Labour be trusted on defence? And welcome back, Camilla Turner. Camilla Tominey is having a well-earned day with her family, so we will be hosting the Daily Tea together.
Well, it's lovely to be back. And more funding for defence will rely on economic growth, the new Chancellor argues. But she also says public finances are in their worst state since the Second World War. So can she square the circle? Now, I don't know the answer to that, but I know someone who does. That is Carl Emmerson, Deputy Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and he'll be joining us a little later to discuss it.
And Camilla found the reform candidate that lots of people thought did not exist. Hang around to hear that amazing story. Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Kamal Ahmed.
And me, Camilla Turner.
Now, Camilla, I must admit, although, of course, delighted to be on the wonderful Daily Tea, a great podcast ahead of us, I do feel a little deflated because thinking about what had I achieved at the age of 16 whilst watching the France-Spain match last night when Lamine Yamal, age 16, scored that wonder goal for Spain when they were 1-0 down. Let's just get a little flick of how the Spanish commentator responded to that goal.
Le puede pegar, viene Lamine en la media luna, le pega Lamine, qué buena va. Pero qué has hecho Lamine, pero qué has hecho chaval.
Not quite the BBC and ITV, but anyway, there's a bit of passion there from the Spanish commentary for the Yamal wonder strike. Of course, he already plays for Barcelona. But I was asking myself, what did you do at the age of 16? And I must admit, almost nothing. Camilla, anything to add in terms of what you would achieve by the age of 16?
I'd say no solid achievements, mainly just partying, I think. If we can call that an achievement.
Breathing. I think still breathing, I thought it was good. But actually, we raised it, didn't we, in our morning meeting at 10 o'clock. And John, who is our output editor, claimed that he had done something quite similar to Yamal. So, John, I'm going to ask you in from the gallery. John is walking in now from the gallery. We have a gallery next door here he is, John. Now, John, I'm going to just ask you to come to Camilla's thing. Now, John, you said that you'd had quite a similar experience to, I must admit, I wasn't aware of it, but you said you had a similar experience to Yamal's wonder goal. Just tell us about it, John.
Not to talk it up, but I did hit one just like that. As I think I must have been 16, 17 against Dean's Hanger Reserves.
Dean's Hanger Reserves,
yeah.
OK, not quite up there with France, but...
No, and it was I think it was 16-0 at the time, and that made it 17-0. So draw your own conclusions on the goalkeeper. It was one of my better.
Excellent.
Better
and who were you playing for? Not Barcelona, presumably.
No. Well, Olney Town. So it goes sort of Barcelona, and then
Olney Town. Not a place I'm overly familiar with.
No,
where is that?
In
Metropolis?
Buckinghamshire.
In Buckinghamshire. Well, lovely that you achieved that.
That's
and
the story.
Your footballing career didn't.
And they spelt my name wrong in the paper afterwards. They spelt it Cardigan. So my crowning moment.
Destroyed.
Ruined.
For the family.
Yeah.
John, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Now, Con, a man of fantastic talent, knowledge, global issues. But just before we get to the serious stuff, Con, any achievements by the age of 16?
Well, in the football realm, my claim to fame, not on the sporting pitch, but I did go to the 1966 World Cup final at Wembley, and I saw England win the World Cup.
My goodness.
Or rather, West Ham won the World Cup because Geoff Hurst scored 3 goals and the other one was by Martin Peters, and Bobby Moore was the captain, and I'm a West Ham fan, so I was in seventh heaven.
What amazing things. And Con, you were hopeful, I think, maybe at the age of 16, that you could be a footballer for West Ham.
Oh, there's always my dream to play for... Every boy in Essex wants to play for West Ham, but I simply didn't have the talent.
Con, it's not over yet. You never know. You never know. Gary Lineker said that how would you stop Yamal from scoring, and he made the point, just give him more homework, which is apparently what he does do in his downtime during the Euros. But let's get on to slightly more serious points.
Yes, a homework question for Labour is about defence, and Keir Starmer's in Washington this week for the 75th anniversary of NATO. Now, this is his first major event on the international stage as Prime Minister, a big opportunity for him to appear as a global statesman, rubbing shoulders with the US President, with the Ukraine leader Zelensky. And really, this has put the whole question of world security and British readiness or otherwise on the map this week. And here's President Biden on the importance of NATO speaking at the conference.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a pivotal moment for Europe, for the transatlantic community, and I might add for the world. Let's remember, the fact that NATO remains the bulwark of global security did not happen by accident. It wasn't inevitable. Again and again at critical moments, we chose unity over disunion, progress over retreat, freedom over tyranny, hope over fear. Again and again, we stood behind our shared vision of a peaceful and prosperous transatlantic community. Here at this summit, we gather to proclaim NATO is ready and able to secure that vision today and well into the future.
Well, at least he didn't fluff his lines. In the UK, there's been a debate, strengthening debate. Many leaders of the armed forces have been lining up to criticise a lack of a timetable, but the Labour government has said it wants to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, but Starmer has as yet not said when he's going to do that or when the government is going to attempt to achieve that. General Sir Patrick Sanders, the former chief of the General Staff, said NATO members may only have until the end of the decade to substantially rearm, to try and ward off these new threats, particularly, of course, in Europe from Russia, but then there's Iran, there's the strength of China, there's this axis of authoritarianism that is talked about, including North Korea.
Now, Keir Starmer and the Labour government have come in for a host of criticism by all sorts of military leaders in the days running up to this NATO summit. We've had Lord West of Spithead, former head of the Navy and a security minister under the last Labour government, saying that setting a timetable for this 2.5% of GDP spending must be set as an example to all European countries.
Now, Con, when you see this debate, you've been round through many, many different governments. You've been round through defence cuts, many defence cuts, the dividend from the ending of the Cold War, for example. Where do you think we are at the moment in terms of the threats on world security? Let's go to 30,000 feet first before we get into the detail of what Labour should be doing.
Well, you're right to mention the sort of end of the Cold War, because what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union was most of the Western countries cashed in their so-called peace dividend. And if you look at the history of the reduction in the fighting strength of our armed forces, it goes back to that period in the early 1990s. And it's progressively got worse since then. But the problems we face now are really to start with the Conservatives taking office in 2010, and as part of the austerity budget and the security and defence review they did in 2010, they basically cut our armed forces by about a third all round. And if you look at the problems we've got with our armed forces, and the reason that all these senior military figures that you mention are now sort of going public with their warnings, is the Navy doesn't have enough warships, the RAF has a dire shortage of combat aircraft, and the Army is down to its smallest size since the Napoleonic era. And the threat environment, as you say, has changed immeasurably since the early 1990s. And we now have this axis of authoritarianism, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. They're all becoming more belligerent in their attitudes. They have strong, some of them have strong military resources. And the fear at the moment is that the UK and its allies in NATO do not have the resources at present to mount an effective deterrent to stop these countries from threatening our well-being.
If we go back to 2010, Con, there was not much controversy over those cuts. If we slightly sleptwalked into this scenario without really realising, I think after the Cold War, my career started, the end of the Cold War, my career started just after that, so in the early 1990s. Defence, I suppose, just didn't seem to be as important.
Well, I think another important element, Kamal, is that in 2010, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had become deeply controversial. And I think the British public had lost its appetite for military action, full stop. And so that whole period after the September the 11th attacks in 2001 saw people regard, and particularly the political classes, basically came to the conclusion there are no votes in defence. If we scale down our military to a level where we can't do anything, then we won't do anything. And then, we did get involved a bit in Libya, but that was very half-hearted, no boots on the ground. We didn't do anything in Syria, despite saying we would do. And so we've seen this, not just the decline in our military strength, but the decline in the military will to take action, and the political will to support such action. So, we're in a bit of a bind. And while we've been busily sort of turning our backs on the threat environment, hostile states have been making hay. And so we now have, war in Ukraine. We've got a war in Gaza. And, there are potential conflicts all around the world now.
That's interesting what you talk about with the political will. I mean, do you think that's in a very different place now, given war on the continent again, and kind of where the public's at in terms of what people believe about the importance of defence spending in the current climate?
Well, I think people are gradually waking up to the fact that the world is changing, and I think most of the British public do understand the threat posed by authoritarian regimes like Russia. I think that they're more ambivalent about the threats from countries like Iran, because they're so far away and so complex. But certainly what Putin has done has just woken people up that there are threats out there. And if he can invade Ukraine, then why not challenge NATO's eastern flank? So I think there are votes in defence these days. And I think one of the really interesting things about the new government is that, when Tony Blair, as you will well remember, Kamal, when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, he was very forthright in standing up against these hostile actors. And we've already seen Blair come out in public on other issues. And I think, the Starmer government will be keen to try and show that it has that kind of resilience that the Blairites had. And they're not going to be pursuing the sort of pacifist, Corbynista tendency that has haunted them in recent years.
And Labour have said it's one of their manifesto pledges to commission this review of defence and then off the back of that decide where more funding and more resources is needed. What is your advice to the Labour government? What would you be telling them about where you think is the most critical need for our defences?
Well, I think there's a degree of sophistry going on here, Camilla. I mean, I think we know what the threats are. We know what we need to do. We had a very serious integrated review carried out by the last government. The conclusions there it reached showed that we needed to strengthen our military capabilities. There are areas that were not addressed, like the size of the army, and there is a big debate going on just how many soldiers do you need on the battlefield when all the fighting is being done by robots and drones and missiles. But in both Gaza and Ukraine, the need for boots on the ground is paramount. And the fact that the Ukrainians are struggling to increase their manpower on the battlefield is seriously hindering their ability to fight. And Patrick Sanders, that Kamal referred to, a great British commander, he made this wonderful comment when he was head of the army: you cannot cyber your way across a river. You need forces on the ground. So there is an ideological debate, but I fear that Labour are just kicking this into the long grass. And the comments made by the Armed Forces Minister this morning that, they're going to wait until there's an economic recovery, until the military gets more money. Well, I don't think we've got that luxury. I think we need to act now.
Interesting that you mentioned the Corbynista era for Labour when Jeremy Corbyn was leading Labour. Labour's had this really problematic relationship with defence. If you go back to 1983 and Michael Foot, unilateral nuclear disarmament, very anti the idea of defence and security being a key part of what a government should do. Famous poster in the 1980s, you'll remember this, Con, when the Conservatives' attack poster against Labour was the picture of a soldier with his arms up saying Labour's defence policy, clearly suggesting surrender. But Jeremy Corbyn was not that long ago, Con. Keir Starmer stood behind this man and said this man should be the leader of the United Kingdom. Do you think, is your sense, though, that actually what Keir Starmer is saying now is more truthful to what he actually wants to achieve, or is he ambivalent about defence, and that is why kick it into the long grass, it's not going to happen quite yet? As you say, Camilla, he could have made this commitment much harder and much earlier.
Well, my own reading of it so far is that Starmer and his senior ministers, David Lammy, Foreign Secretary, and Healey, the Defence Secretary, they're almost overcompensating for the whole Corbyn era. And, they're saying NATO first, and we ought to be strong. Starmer at the weekend was saying defence the realm, first duty of government. All the platitudes are coming out. But I think, and of course they've renewed our commitment to supporting Ukraine. But I think they are trying very hard. But I think people are going to be looking very hard at just how they approach defence in particular, because wars. We don't choose wars; wars choose us. And we have seen, both with Ukraine and the Gaza conflict, that suddenly out of nowhere you have a hot conflict. And as Patrick Sanders said, just as after standing down as head of the army, we are ill-prepared. The army is not able to conduct combat operations at scale for any period of time. It's under-equipped. We don't have enough, as I said, warships and warplanes. These need to be addressed as a matter of urgency. And I also think, personally, it's a bit rich for Starmer to go to Washington for the NATO summit and lecture everybody else in NATO about reaching 2.5% of GDP on defence when we're not doing it ourselves. And let's not forget that one of Rishi Sunak's last acts as Prime Minister was to make a commitment to raise defence to that level by 2030. That's 75 billion extra for the armed forces. That's a lot of kit. And that would start to make us look credible. And the point I always make is that having properly resourced military is important, not because we want to go to war, but because we want to defend ourselves. This is the deterrence. If we have an effective deterrence, if people like Putin look at our armed forces and the strength of our allies and see we mean business, then they hesitate about taking the kind of actions they've taken in Ukraine and elsewhere. So this is really important for our national security. And I just get this sense they're dodging the bullet at the moment.
Con, you're going to be writing about this, I think, for today and tomorrow's paper,
Correct.
Which will be brilliant for people to go and see. We're also going to have some letters, many of those from former service people. One example is a letter going to be published later today and into tomorrow's paper from Rear Admiral Philip Mathias, retired Director of Nuclear Policy 2005 to 2008, who will be arguing that Starmer's rhetoric, very similar to what you're saying, Con, is not matched by a substantial plan. And he also will be pointing out that Russia, China and North Korea and Iran pose a threat now, not in the fullness of time, not going to be waiting for a strategic review. Con, thank you so much for your deep expertise on this issue and sharing it with the Daily Tea.
Now, it's all very well Sir Keir Starmer trying to position himself as someone who can be trusted on defence spending, but what he and his Chancellor Rachel Reeves needs to work out is how they are going to pay for any increase in funds. Rachel Reeves used her maiden speech as Chancellor to warn that the economy is in a terrible state.
I have repeatedly warned that whoever won the general election would inherit the worst set of circumstances since the Second World War. What I have seen in the past 72 hours has only confirmed that.
That was Rachel Reeves there, her speech earlier this week. And she said again and again that her big solution is to foster growth in the economy, which will raise money for public spending across society in areas like health, defence and education. Labour's goal is to achieve the highest sustained growth in the G7. But just how doable is this?
Now, Camilla, what Rachel Reeves has done has made this the big mission of government. I think it's the big area that they are going to be tested on. It's the win or fail option, I think, in terms of their policies. She also said in that speech that she had commissioned the Treasury to look at the state of the public finances, and we're expecting that to be published in the next week or so. She said certainly before the summer break for Parliament. So that will be a very useful document for us to look at. And there's already been speculation that she will use that report to start saying, actually, it's much worse than we thought. Maybe there could be tax increases ahead. I've always thought that Reeves does not want to raise taxes. She made it so clear. I know there were nuances about, is it this tax, is it that tax? But she wanted taxes to fall for working people. To reverse that in the first 3 to 6 months of this new government, I think would be politically disastrous. So let's see where we go on that.
That's right. And obviously the whole question and debate around tax rises was a huge feature of the campaign and something the Tories were attacking Labour over again and again. Now, we're very lucky to have with us on the Daily Tea Carl Emmerson, Deputy Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Thank you so much for joining us. And first of all, do you agree with Rachel Reeves? Is our economy really in the worst state it's been since the Second World War?
I'm not quite sure about that claim, but I think in terms of the government's finances, there are some metrics on which it is a very, very difficult time to be Chancellor. The outlook for growth is pretty weak by the levels that we enjoyed at least up until the financial crisis. Over the last 15 years, we've accumulated a lot of government debt for good reasons when government's been supporting households and businesses and public services, but there's a lot more debt now. And that's no longer financed at the ultra low interest rates that we got used to in the 2010s. So that debt interest bill was growing. We already have taxes as a share of GDP at a level that we've never sustained before in the UK. And yet there are many public services under a lot of very, very visible strain and lots of pressures, for example, and more spending, for example, on defence. So that challenge of tax is already high, but you're spending a lot of money on debt interest spending. There's also a lot of money being spent now on benefits for those with health-related conditions. Lots of public services under a lot of pressure, and a newly elected government that seems to want to have both debt falling, it seems to be complaining that taxes are high, and it seems to want no more austerity for public services. A very difficult set of things to square.
Now, Carl, we've been around these houses before. When I was economics editor, you helped me a lot with the analysis that the Institute for Fiscal Studies does on the public finances. These hubristic statements by politicians of the worst since, I think it's a bit of a stretch, frankly. We've had the financial crisis, which absolutely cratered the public finances. We had COVID, which put us through a once-in-a-century pressure position for the public finances. But let's put that to one side. As I said, she's commissioned this new report from the Treasury, which is she's already suggesting will say, goodness me, we came in as the new government, we opened the bonnet on the public finances and all these snakes jumped out and we were really surprised that there were all these snakes and golly, it's awful now. We didn't realise it was so bad. Is that a justifiable position? Do new governments come in and suddenly realise that the public finances are far worse than they thought?
Well, in the olden days, they certainly used to like to. You can see why a chancellor might like to have forecasts that are very, very pessimistic at the start of their tenure, in order to be able to be surprised on the upside subsequently. But of course, in the past, the forecasts they inherited were the judgment of the previous chancellor. So they could say, well, the previous chancellor had made these over-optimistic forecasts about the economy, about tax revenues. We're no longer in that world. We have an independent Office of Budget Responsibility who's producing their essential forecasts for the economy and the public finances. All the details of those are published, so you may or may not agree with them, but at least you now have the detail that allows you to work out why you disagree. And in terms of the quality of public services, I think it's worth noting that we already know what condition they're in. We can see, for example, NHS waiting lists at very high levels. We know that prisons are pretty much full. We know that there are huge backlogs in the court. So the quality of public services seems to me it's pretty well known that there's many that are struggling. The pressures on, for example, defence spending are pretty clear. We know that there's a war going on in Eastern Europe. All of those pressures are known. The OBR's growth forecasts are known, and actually they're more optimistic than most. They're more optimistic than the Bank of England, but that's all known. I guess where there might be a little bit that Rachel Reeves could point to would be if there were certain decisions that were being still in the in tray of ministers before the election, perhaps some decisions that had spending attached to them that they were maybe deferring because they thought that could be someone else's decision towards the end of the year. Maybe more kindly, some decisions that just got timed out. So, for example, around infected blood, where we know that the legislation was pushed through right at the very last moment, and we know that there's going to be some public spending consequences for that compensation. But they're pretty small beer in terms of the ongoing pressures that we see in our economy, on the tax system, and on public spending more generally.
And you said during the election campaign that both parties committed to reducing Britain's debt in the next 5 years. So this will require some combination of tax rises or spending cuts. Obviously, since then, Labour have won the election. Rachel Reeves is now Chancellor. And I wondered if you thought there's anything she said that's indicated to you that, to kind of steer you away from this assessment, or whether that very much still stands.
I think our assessment still stands. I mean, there was clearly, it sounds like a firm commitment to have debt falling as a share of GDP at the end of this Parliament. There are good reasons to want debt on a downwards trajectory, but there's nothing special about years 4 and 5. The incoming government could have said, well, actually, we're going to take a bit longer to get ourselves on that trajectory because we need more time to get things right, but they've not chosen to take that course of action. They've got some very specific and relatively modest tax rises that are to pay for very specific increases in spending. If you still want to keep to the spending plans that they inherit from Jeremy Hunt, that does mean some cuts for some departments, given that we know the NHS is going to see an increase in its budget. We know the defence will see an increase in its budget. There are commitments elsewhere, for example, on childcare. So some areas of government, like local government, like prisons, like courts, look like they could be facing greater cuts. And I think that's where it looks very difficult, because all those areas of government had big cuts through the 2010s and are also under very visible signs of strain now.
And just a final question, if that's all right. So Labour committed to continuing with the Tory policy of freezing tax thresholds until 2028. So that's this policy of fiscal drag, making people pay more tax from the money they earn. Do you think this is something over the next few years that our listeners, people across the country, are really going to feel in their pockets?
One of the reasons why taxes are relatively high at the moment, and indeed forecast to keep rising, is precisely that. The previous government put in place a policy of freezing pretty much any threshold or allowance you can think of in the personal tax system. That means more people paying income tax, more employers having to pay national insurance, more individuals having to pay higher rate tax and additional rate tax. So that's the situation Labour's inherited, and that continues right the way through till March 2028. More people being dragged into higher rates of tax. And it will mean that there's a relatively stealthy way of paying tax, but it does mean people paying more tax as a share of their income. And that's one of the ways in which the government's looking to push up taxes in order to get debt falling at the end of the Parliament.
Carl, help me. The central offer, the central promise of Rachel Reeves is that growth will pay for all these bills that are coming down the track, the improvements that need to be made. Growth comes slowly. all these claims on the public finances, the demands that are piling up in Rachel Reeves' in tray are immediate. You've got this 24 hours, all these demands are already there, but growth may be a process of many, many years. Am I missing something, or can the government legitimately say to the public, we can wait for the growth to increase the revenues the government receives to pay for all the things we know we need to do? To me, those skis are going in opposite directions, and that's always painful.
I think the government is right to say that growth should be a focus, and we know there's lots of things the government can do to boost growth, and it'd be great for them to relentlessly focus on those things. But I think you're right about the timescales. If you're going to have a relentless focus on growth, on education policy, competition policy, planning, immigration, trade, tax reform, right across the board, are very much welcome with that, and we know that that could make a positive difference in the medium and long run. But it's not going to deliver more growth in the very near term. It's not going to deliver more tax revenues to pay for public services in the near term. If that's your strategy, you have to do those policies and be patient. And you can take planning reform as the obvious one. If you get that right, yes, building more homes in the places where people want to live and work would be a good thing for growth, but it's going to take years before that materialises and you reap the reward. So there's going to be a big challenge about what does Rachel Reeves do this autumn in her spending review when she's got to try and make those numbers add up, and before any growth has come through. And I suspect any plans for growth would yet to be convincing the OBR about why they should increase their forecasts 3, 4, 5 years out. I think they'll want to see some firm evidence of growth policies being implemented and actually yielding some results before they start to say the prospects for the economy over the next few years now look better.
Should most people be thinking my taxes on my income are going to increase given the pressures that you've outlined?
Well, there's the tax rises that are already in place that are coming, that we've just spoken about, that the new government's inherited. There are those specific tax rises that were in the Labour Party manifesto. I think the big question is, will the budget contain further tax rises that we haven't yet heard about? We don't know that's the case. The rhetoric from the government seems to be very much that they don't want to do that, and they've certainly spoken about not putting up taxes on working people, although that definition is almost certainly one that's quite hard to nail down. Having said that, history tells us that it's quite common to see big tax rises in the first year of a parliament, whoever is Chancellor, and I think it's fair to say that those tax rises are often ones that we weren't told about in the winning party's election manifesto. So I at least won't be surprised if we see some tax rises this autumn.
We've been around these houses before. Just finally, Carl, we've been talking about defence a lot in this podcast, about the demands around defence spending, the security risks globally that are growing. Obviously, the NHS is also a central part of what the government has said it is going to fix. There are going to be some big trade-offs, aren't there?
That's one of the very big challenges for the government, and it's in stark contrast to what previous governments have been able to do. So if you go back through the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, chancellors have often increased NHS spending as a share of GDP, and been able to do that without increasing the overall size of the state, because defence spending has been coming down, in particular as we reap the rewards of the end of the Cold War and then peace in Northern Ireland. So defence spending falling, NHS spending rising. If we look forward over the next 5 years, I think we can be pretty confident that we're not going to be cutting defence spending any further, and we might well be increasing it. And I think we can also be pretty confident we're going to be increasing NHS spending as a share of GDP again. So it could be the first time in a long while we see both defence and NHS spending on an upwards trajectory, rather than cuts to defence spending essentially being enough to pay for increases in the health service.
That's the tough decisions that mean being in government is very different from being in opposition. Carl Emmerson, thank you so much for giving us that analysis.
We'll finish the Daily Tea today with a remarkable exclusive story by our colleagues Hayley Dixon and Tracy Candola. They've managed to track down Helen Burns, a candidate for reform in Glasgow North at the last election, who made headlines after online sleuths speculated that she didn't actually exist.
This was such a bizarre story, Camilla. One of the more bizarre stories of the election.
Absolutely, but we're still talking about it now. Now, the reason that online sleuths speculated as such was because there were no pictures of her. Her social media presence was zero. There was nothing linking her to the Reform Party. She didn't turn up on the campaign trail or at the count on election night. But lo and behold, our reporters have tracked down the real Helen Burns. And here's some audio of her now.
Hi, I'm Helen Burns, Reform UK's candidate for Glasgow North. You may have seen the fake news spread by media outlets over the past few days claiming I don't exist. I do indeed very much exist. I stood for Reform UK because I believe in Nigel and the identity and values of the contract, and believe Reform will secure our future as a sovereign nation. I stood for a constituency in Scotland as the country holds a very special place in my heart. We have travelled to many areas in Scotland over the past 20 years and indeed got married in a small hunting lodge near Aviemore in 2019. This was featured in Scottish Wedding magazine. I believe in Britain and I believe Britain needs reform.
Well, thank you very much, Helen, for that detail about the wedding. We should be looking up in that wedding magazine and see if we can find a picture of her. She pronounces reform slightly oddly, and she did pause for quite a long time, remembering her surname. She's not AI, of course, is she, Camilla? She's not AI.
I don't think so. I mean, I don't know if that audio is the most convincing to show she's a real person, but, you know, our reporters did track her down and meet her face to face, so you can't argue with that.
Well done to Hayley and to Tracy, and welcome, Helen, to the real world, or the world of politics, so good to hear. It'll be interesting to see. I think she wasn't the only ghost candidate that Reform, I think, slightly struggled with. There was another, his name was Mart Matlock. He was the party's unsuccessful candidate in Clapham and Brixton Hill in South London. Again, not that present during that campaign. He actually released a picture or a video of him dancing to try and prove that he wasn't AI. Yes, one of the more stories on the byways of the election, but quite interesting that lots of these sleuths who work so hard on behalf of us all to find out the truth are following these possibly, well, certainly questionable candidates.
That's right. And we should just add that a Reform UK spokesman has said the suggestion that they fielded fake candidates in the election on the ballot papers, which requires both local election agents as well as 10 nomination signatures, were preposterous.
Absolutely. So good to hear that Helen is alive and well and hopefully still married.